And just like that, we are once again face to face with another Lord Ravager in Honkai Star Rail. Except this one has a lot of faces. And I don't know about you, but after finishing 4.3, I almost immediately needed a recap on Asat Pramad's newly revealed identities, because that patch threw so much stuff at us at a breakneck pace. And if you walked away from that needing a reminder on what just happened, you are not alone. So in this video, I wanted to recap the many names Asat Pramad has used across the ages, the types of shenanigans he got up to while using them, and take a quick moment to try and figure out what his unusual actions could mean for Star Rail's future. But before we do any of that, I have to take a minute to deliver my "I told you so" speech about Himiko, which of course means we are about to get into spoiler territory for the latest patch, so if you are not up to date, don't say I didn't warn you. So back in 4.0, I made a whole video about the idea that Himiko was fake and likely some sort of imagine, and how the comments told me I was wrong. Yet here I am now that 4.3 has wrapped, and I am sitting here feeling so proud in all my correctness. Sure, it was a case of right idea, wrong artist, but gosh, it felt so good to have been on the right track with that one. If you want to take a look at my whole "it's all a fanfic" theory, now that we have more info, make sure you check out the full vid for a little bit of fun. Okay, I've said what I wanted to say on that subject, so let's begin our deep dive into Asat Pramad. Timestamps are below, spoilers shall be abundant, and if you want to keep up to date with my latest videos, don't forget to like and subscribe. The place that probably makes the most sense to start with in this recap is Asat Pramad's earliest known identity as Enroute. Enroute was a relatively famous masked fool during the point in time known as the Second Prosperity. He was close friends with another well-known fool from the era named Bragi, the legendary bartender of the World's End Tavern. According to Bragi's resignation letter, Enroute was the most joyful of all masked fools. Now, interestingly, this readable was updated for the 4.3 patch. Previously, the name listed was not Enroute, but rather absenti, which quite literally means absent in Latin. This means it was either a mistranslation or a direct obfuscation by Asat Pramad, or maybe the history fictionologists, and I like the idea of the latter, so I'm going to go with that. The resignation letter also makes note of the time where Enroute pranked an Aeon, which was revealed to be the Veracity. Despite being regarded as one of the funniest and most joyful of all Elation followers, the rumors say that he stopped laughing after hearing all 30 trillion jokes in the universe. But Bragi alleges that the tavern just wasn't funny enough for him anymore, which is why he set off to find the real edge of the world. We also know that Enroute was in possession of a treasure known as the Ring of Misfortune from the non-random treasure map readable. This ring is interesting because we have a number of accounts that confirm that Enroute had a habit of showing up in places he wasn't welcome, which were thought to be a result of owning this ring. However, this is proven false when we start to uncover his other identities. That said, when wearing the ring, a series of coincidences typically guide him straight towards misfortune. The use of misfortune and luck in this text demonstrates a lot of the qualities that are attributed to Asat Pramad's powers with the destruction. Now, legend has it that this Ring of Misfortune came into Enroute's possession after Aha lost to him in a wager. The last point worth mentioning from this article is that Enroute is noted as being obsessed with experiencing brilliant and glorious stories, recording them with his paintbrush, which makes a lot of sense when we consider his other aliases and his connection to the Graphias that we get to later on. According to Old Lamp, one of Enroute's oldest friends who wrote about him in Stories of Enroute, they felt as if Enroute took elation too seriously, specifically that he'd go wherever people needed a laugh or wherever things were going south, throwing himself into the game like a chess piece just for the thrill. He seemed like a loose cannon, but he was actually an elation fundamentalist through and through. There also exists a legend which suggests that Enroute, along with his friends from the tavern, Shepard, Dorothy and Bragi, was swallowed by Ouroboros themselves. And as they explored its endless belly, they kicked the Veracity's heart and were belched out into the universe once more. As they exited, Enroute plucked their shadow after Shepard tossed a comet, allowing the fools to escape with Ouroboros, never to be seen again as it chased the comet into the distance. And that's about all we know of the person who went by the name Enroute, because naturally a fool so joyful could not be entertained by the World's End Tavern forever. So instead, he left the elation behind and sought out the true World's End. When he departed, he shared a joke with Bragi. Just look at this tavern. The universe is dying outside, yet everyone stays safe and sound by hiding in here. Elation should have been something magnificent, but these fools refuse to pay the cost that comes with the joke. Behind their laughter, all I see is the decay and rot of the second prosperity. Don't you think these people, the ones who don't even know what they're laughing at, are a much bigger joke than anything else in the outside world? And so, Enroute turned towards a new path in search of the edge of the world, which led them to the trailblazers of the Astral Express. According to Akavilli's databank entry, they were in search of the endpoint of the Tree of Existence, also known as the Imaginary Tree. So who better to journey with to find the literal end of the known universe? As Enroute boarded the Astral Express, he left his former name behind and adopted the name Isee. And thanks to the release of the relic set, as Navigator Isee sees it, we know a lot more about this mysterious figure's time on the Express. When Isee's journey first began as a Nameless, Akavilli was still active. In a conversation with Dolly, a musician who went on to become the Express's navigator for 3 days before crystallizing into what is assumed to be 6-phased ice, and not to be confused with Himiko's Imagenesis teacher, Miss Dolly, Isee detailed the unusual nature of his Everstrider boots. The shoes allegedly take him wherever he is not welcome, which disproves the theory that his Ring of Misfortune was the source of that power. At the start of his Nameless journey, Isee retained a lot of his qualities from his time as a masked fool. He was known for his charisma and performed stand-up comedy every night for his fellow passengers, and even the Aeon of Trailblaze themselves. When not telling jokes, Isee recorded astral charts, documenting the many journeys of the Nameless crew. However, as their travels continued, Isee became more and more jaded by his experiences. He always set out with hope, but in his eyes, the planets they saved all descended into shameless spectacles, growing accustomed to their comforts and chasing thrilling pleasures that led them towards an elating self-destruction. Then came the day that Isee watched as Akavilli disappeared. According to the Navigator's astral chart uniform relic, the dense clusters of stars turned into tiny dots on the star map when they grew ever closer to the edge of the cosmos. There he witnessed the fall of the god of Trailblaze, that being who yearned to transcend the universe's end, to venture beyond the paths themselves, vanished from sight, leaving behind nothing but a small speck of light. Now, for a long time, people have speculated that our MC is Akavilli reborn, and this piece of writing, coupled with the way Asat Pramad describes Akavilli embarking on a new journey in the Fable Among the Stars trailer, makes me wonder if that is as close to confirmation as we could get at this stage. But I'll leave that for you to think about, because I'm not quite sure myself yet. Upon losing Akavilli as they got closer to the edge of the world, Isee wasn't okay. They had fond memories with the Aeon and lent on them for help when his path felt unclear. So I want to look at the very specific wording here. What was it all for? He wiped the tears from his eyes and laughed into the endless void. Turns out they didn't have the answer either. Turns out this path leads to a dead end. What a sick joke. Absolutely sick. The endless void and a dead end are opposing ideas. The way I interpret this is that Isee wants to find the end of the world, and a never-ending void is very much a dead end when it comes to finding an actual end. And even writing this down feels like a maddening sentiment, so I can see why Isee went a little bit off the rails after this. Now, according to Dolly's Cosmodesy report, when Akavilli fell, the Express was in motion and the Nameless all felt the fall of the Trailblaze. This implies that Isee wasn't on the Express at the time if they witnessed their end, which means he wasn't on board but was close enough to board within 3 days of Akavilli's demise. We know this because Dolly was the navigator of the Express at the time, but she began to crystallize over the course of the 3 days that followed the Aeon's fall. And it was Isee who took over the navigator position after this. Isee's tenure as Navigator was a rough time for the Astral Express. Fights broke out about who should succeed him as Navigator, resulting in chaos and even murder on board. To resolve this issue, Isee conducted elaborate games by spinning the die on his ring, which I can't help but wonder if it's actually the Ring of Misfortune, which sent the Nameless on absurd missions which many never returned from. The passenger numbers dwindled, but the Express continued on. That is until Isee came to Adlevin. And it was there that he witnessed the birth of Nanook, the Aeon of Destruction. The moment was recorded in his stargazing logs, which abruptly end upon seeing the countless stars extinguished in silence. Now, before Akavili's disappearance, Isee asked them, "Why is it that I seek answers, yet all I find is a life full of questions?" So it seems fitting that upon marveling at the ascent of the destruction, that Isee's last recorded words in the logs were golden blood, flames, destruction, birth, answer, appears? Because he has found a new path that could potentially lead him towards the end of the world he so desperately seeks. Little other record of Isee's time as Navigator exists, reportedly due to tampering by the history fictionologists, which honestly tracks. And with that, the Navigator position of the Astral Express was handed on to Falcon Amundsen as Isee turned away from the Trailblaze and began to walk the path of destruction. But that's not all we know about Isee's time as Navigator that's worth mentioning. According to Isee's Cosmodesy report, during the time he stepped down, the Omen Vanguards began to appear in the universe, which is heavily implying his involvement as the potential founder. What makes this mighty fascinating is that the Omen Vanguards are heavily linked to the finality, the path that will end the universe, which is understandable given what we know about Isee so far. But what doesn't make sense is the fact that the Vanguards have a positive reputation across the cosmos, deciphering the mutterings of Terminus to prevent future calamities. So why would someone so eager to find the world's end create a faction working against it? Another weird contradiction is Isee's ties to Ashvale. In 4.3, we find out that former Navigator Isee gave Ashvale the shadow of Ouroboros. It was a remnant of his journey skirting the edge of the cosmos as a Nameless, but that isn't necessarily true, because we hear that Enroute is the one that potentially plucked the shadow during their time as a masked fool. But coming back to the Navigator, if he's retired, he was likely already an emanator of destruction at the time he gave this to Ashvale, because he used the Isee identity. And of course, Ashvale then used this shadow to kill another Lord Ravager of Destruction. So once again, why is he seemingly working against his own path? But save that thought for now, because we'll get back to it when we come to his most recent identity. Instead, let's spend some time looking at his time as Asat Pramad, the Lord Ravager of Destruction, targeting the end of Elation. Now, the identity we are most familiar with, Asat Pramad. So many years of feeling lost and frustrated with the world's inclination towards the elation have molded Asat into the perfect antagonist. Described as calculating, composed, and malicious, he considers every possibility and manipulates the game of war like a personal chessboard. The best example of this was his work on Oglering, where he had Void Rangers advance inch by inch to overwhelm the enemy's defensive line, to spell out the sentence, "Destruction is where laughter ends." It is mourning, not celebration. Whilst the time frame of his elevation to the status of Emanator is unspecified in-game, the earliest known record we have of his actions under the moniker of Asat Pramad were in 2148 Amber Era, when he invaded Aha-topia. And of course, if you're up to date with Honkai Star Rail, then the rest of this information should be pretty familiar, so I'll try and keep this section snappy. During Asat Pramad's invasion, he came upon an infant on the verge of death, who would later become known as Graphia. Asat was reminded of Aha's ascension parable and decided it would be amusing to raise the child. So he imbued her with the power of destruction and rebirthed her as a Void Ranger. He taught her to paint using the power of veracity in order to carry out the Antimatter Legion's will. But the invasion of our Heartopia continued on relentlessly until the day that Graphia saw a streak across the sky. The monolith that would be known as a Tower of Infinity, which was in truth the crashed Astral Express. Naturally, given his history as a Nameless, it was Asat that tried to destroy the Astral Express. In 2149 Amber Era, Graphia turned against Asat and used the power of the Phantasmoon games in an attempt to seal the world in canvas. But in doing so, she obtained the Weathering Curse, which is described exactly by Asat Pramad as the inescapable price for being a child of destruction who dares betray their fate. In the millennia since this incident, we can only assume that Asat has been up to some shenanigans. The only real thing we know is that he came back at some point recently to give Full Wish her masked-full mask. But one of the most important things we know about what he did during this time were his actions under a different identity, Ryusuke. At some point, Ryusuke was a man that fell in love with Murata Roan and his daughter Himiko. So much so that he went off-world in search of a cure for her Weathering Curse. But in his travels, he was killed by Asat Pramad, who destroyed his body and assumed his identity. When Himiko was 6 years old, Asat as Ryusuke introduced himself to his daughter for the first time, with the young Himiko being unaware of any deception. Because, she was 6. So Himiko grew up with a relatively absent father who was still regarded as a world-renowned painter and dean of Graphia Academy, with the worlds he visited often being laid to waste at the hands of his true identity as a Lord Ravager, leaving a signature laugh burned into the destroyed planets he left in his wake. Now, one of the most interesting revelations Ryusuke provides in 4.3 is when he tells Himiko that he is afflicted with the Weathering Curse. He also states that he only ever told her one lie, and that was when he introduced himself as Himiko's father all those years ago. And if he is to be believed, then this means he does in fact have the Weathering Curse. But hang on a minute, he explained that the way one becomes afflicted with the disease is to betray their fate as a child of destruction. So we could be looking at a world where Asat Pramad has turned away from the path of destruction. I think I might have some ideas as to why. From here on out, everything is mostly speculation based on what we know so far. So let's recap on what we know about Asat Pramad and his very weird behavior. He gave Ashvale the Shadow of Veracity to destroy another Emanator of Destruction. He is implied to have instigated the original Herald of Death incident, which indirectly saw the Express travel again on the Silver Rails. He has the Weathering Curse, which means he potentially no longer follows the wishes of destruction. He came back to Plane Arcadia to meet a true Nameless in Himiko. He reportedly started the Omen Vanguards who disseminate the prophecy known as the Theory of Four Apocalypses that push the cosmos towards finality. And in the Anti-Destruction Alliance trailer, Asat Pramad says, declaring war against Nanook? Count me in. So taking that last statement at face value, Asat Pramad is willing to go to war in opposition of destruction, but is still a Lord Ravager for destruction. If that's the case, there are only a few good reasons I can think of. 1, he's trying to find the end of the world through the path of finality, although that goes against the nature of the Omen Vanguards unless he is angling to become Terminus, but that kind of doesn't fit with the whole cat thing and all the info that came out in 3.8. 2, Asat Pramad is actually trying to become Aha. And the reason that the Phantasmoon declaring the winner of the next games shall permanently become the Aeon is so that he could kill himself once granted the authority. Because that would be a really messed up joke and would serve the will of both elation and destruction, but that kind of doesn't work because of the Weathering Curse information, because it does what the destruction wants, which is to end the Aeons. And 3, my wild theory based on nothing but vibes is that given Asat Pramad is a ruthless calculator who can use his die casts to sense every outcome, I do wonder if he's seen the world where the Trailblaze becomes the fourth kind of finality detailed in the Theory of Four Apocalypses, which is why his actions have inadvertently led back towards the Astral Express time and time again. But honestly, it's gnawing at my brain not being able to figure out the exact connection as to why he would do any of this. So if you have any better ideas, please enlighten me in the comments, because it is killing me. Now, there's a whole lot more that could be said here, especially when you have the Omen Vanguard's theory front of mind, because then you start seeing how close in the Star Rail timeline events like the Stellaron's first discovery are to the founding of Amphorius, and La Mancha devouring Zulo, plus Polka Kakamond creating Device IX, and honestly, it's all too much for my lore enjoyer brain right now, so I am choosing to let it rest here, while we wait for hopefully many answers to come in the next patch as we resolve all of this Asat Pramad business. Either way, I hope you've found this to be an informative little journey through the fascinating history of the Lord Ravager Asat Pramad, because let me tell you, this has been a great recap for my own mind, and again, I hope it was for you too. So if you did like this, don't forget to drop a comment, a like, and a sub. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you in the next video.